I could feel the trees just smacking against the bottom of the airplane, and it was rapid. It was like a machine gun sound hitting the bottom of the airplane. And then all of a sudden they all went back into the cloud.
Welcome to Flying BC, a podcast about the people, planes, and aviation adventures in British Columbia and Canada, with your host, Warwick Patterson.
178 seconds to live. Just under 3 minutes. If you're a pilot, you've no doubt heard this statistic. Continued visual flight into instrument conditions claims a disproportionate number of GA pilots every year. It's easy to think, I'll never do that. And yet, it keeps happening. On this, the third episode of Flying BC, you'll meet James Marasa. James is an IFR Air Traffic Controller in Vancouver, but he was once a flight instructor who used up a lot of those seconds. He lived to tell the tale, and this is his story. James, thanks for joining me.
It's my pleasure, Warwick.
Yeah. I wanted to bring you on because a couple weeks ago I was at NAV Canada's Flight Instructor Safety Stand Down, where you presented your incredible story. And I knew we had to get it out to more people because it's one for the ages. I listened to you twice over the course of the day, and even the second time, like, my stress levels were rising. I was getting anxious just listening to you. And I'm pretty sure there's even a few tears of emotion and relief at the end of your presentations in the room. It's kind of like that Scared Straight TV program. Like, the story will scare a lot of people into better decisions.
Right.
So I don't want to do too much of a preamble on this one. I'm just going to let you run with the story because it's it stands on its own.
Well, thank you, Warwick. It raises some emotion in me every time I tell it. So I've never actually sat and listened to it myself, obviously, but to tell it really puts me back in the airplane every single time. So yeah, I get the same feeling in my throat. The heart rate tends to elevate, but it's not meant to scare people. It might have that effect, but when I started writing about this and started speaking to flight schools, the intent was, because I didn't really want to talk about it, let's be honest, but the intent was to educate and maybe give people an idea of, how fast things can spiral out of control, and give them some guidance, something to touch back on if they ever find themselves having to make a decision.
Yeah, awesome.
So, basically we would have to go back to 2001. 2003. I'm getting my dates crossed because of all the references to 9/11 these days and what's happening with the aviation industry. But it was 2003, January. I was a flight instructor at Boundary Bay, and I was working with a student on her commercial license. And now it was a pretty bleak winter. There was some pretty terrible weather that year, and we were having trouble finishing her license. So we were scheduled to do some upper air work, and we've been trying for weeks to get that in. And on this particular day, the ceiling was about 1,500 feet, and there was a strong easterly wind. I remember it was a bit of a dynamic weather day. So it wasn't just the low, benign, drizzly overcast we often get. There was quite a bit of wind, and it was quite showery as well. But we decided to fly. So we got in the airplane and we leveled off, I think, about 1,200 feet, heading east over Blackie Spit. And it was clear at the time we weren't going to be able to get any altitude to do the upper air work. So I had the student put the hood on, and at the time, VOR and ADF was still being widely used. So we did some VOR tracking off the Pitt Meadows VOR while she was under the hood. And as we headed towards Pitt Meadows, the weather started to look a little better. I mean, it had been solid overcast for a long time. And after, people in Vancouver can relate. After seeing months or weeks of overcast, when you see that first bit of blue sky, it's really enticing. So that's what we saw, just a bit of blue sky opening up over overhead Pitt Meadows. And I thought, well, let's head on over there. Now, I wasn't an air traffic controller at the time, but I thought I would practice some vectoring. So I gave her headings to fly. We moved overhead the airport, and it started to look like we might be able to climb, might be able to get some altitude. So I had her climb to 3,000 feet, and things were looking okay. So once we got up to altitude, which 3,000 feet is pretty standard for upper air work in the Fraser Valley, I had her clear the hood and look around. And she was happy to see some sunshine as well. And started the checks. I believe it was a halt check we did at the time before doing upper air work. Now, as she started to go through the checks, the height, the aircraft, the location, I started to notice that the weather wasn't quite as nice as it had been when we climbed up through the hole. As I said before, it was a dynamic weather day. And I can't really say it was factoring into my decision making all that much at this point. I just saw an opening and thought we might be able to get some work done. But once we were up there, I could see things were starting to change. At that point, I thought I better take control. And one thing I like to say when I talk to flight schools, when it comes to decision making, is one thing, you have to have situational awareness. You have to be aware of what's going on around you. But you also have to reevaluate the decision as you go. That's one of the tenets of, or one of the cornerstones rather, of air traffic control, is being able to look at the situation, make a plan, and when the plan's not working, adjust on the fly. It's not easy to do, but it's a necessary skill. And I have to say, at that point, I saw that this wasn't working and decided to make an adjustment. So I took control of the airplane and started the descent back down to where we'd climbed. But the gap in the clouds, which we'd climbed through, was a heck of a lot smaller now than when we climbed through it. And I wasn't able to make it back down. So I actually had to put the aircraft back in a climb and level off again. I started to look around at this point, and I really couldn't see any outs in my visual range. There was now a solid overcast layer below me and a solid overcast layer above me. And it just felt literally we were sandwiched between two layers somewhere over Pitt Meadows. I'm going to guess about 3,500 feet. So at that point, I realized I'd been caught. And if we look at it now, if we armchair quarterback it, it's pretty obvious what should have happened next. If I could go back in time, it's very clear that that was the time to call air traffic control and ask for assistance. But I didn't do that, or we'd be done talking at this stage. That would have been a very benign story. But I think it's important to talk about why I didn't, because it's easy to look at a situation and say, hey, why did they do that? Obviously they should have turned around. Obviously they shouldn't have gone, or obviously they should have called air traffic control. At the time, I had about 400 hours. I was about 20 years old, and I was in charge of the airplane. I was the pilot in command, and this student had hired me to do a job, and I really wanted to look like I knew what I was doing. I did not want to admit I made a mistake. I think she knew by this point, but I didn't want to have to explain myself after the fact either, because I thought as soon as I key the mic and talk to air traffic control, Transport Canada is going to get a fax. They're going to hear about this. My CFI is going to be waiting for me on the ground, and I'm going to be in trouble, or I've got to explain how I got into that situation. So I thought, if there's any way I can fix this without having to call ATC, without having to get anyone else involved, I'm going to do that. So I said, let's turn this into a training opportunity. We were doing VOR tracking anyways. So I thought, let's try and establish a fix off the Whatcom and the Pitt Meadows VOR to see if we can determine our position, because it wasn't easy to tell at that point since we were surrounded by cloud in all directions. And I thought I might have seen a little bit better weather out east towards Mission, so we headed out that way. In retrospect, I don't think there was, but I really wanted to see something better than what I was looking at. So it's amazing how the mind will play tricks on you and show you what you want to see in those situations. The stress level wasn't too high yet, though. But as we got towards Mission, I could see that there really wasn't much there in the way of us being able to descend. At that point, things started to speed up for me. And I think looking back at it now, having told the story many times, that's kind of a clue. When things start to speed up and you start feeling you have to make a decision really quickly, you might not be making the best decision. So it's important to slow things down. But I wasn't there at the time.
And for the people who don't fly around Vancouver, a little bit of lay of the land is probably important too. Like Vancouver in the valley is flat, but there's mountains on every side, basically.
That's correct. And out over the best course of action would have been head the complete opposite direction, which is west, because we have nothing but water out west of Vancouver. And then, as you say, Warwick, it's flat in the Fraser Valley. But to the north and to the east, the mountains rise quite quickly. So I was actually headed towards higher terrain. Nevertheless, when I got over towards Mission, I actually saw a hole in the clouds beneath me. And looking, I was in the right seat, so looking out over my shoulder, and just seeing a green farmer's field, I thought, this is my out. That's it, because I know the ceiling's 1,500 feet, so we're about 3,000 or so. If I can just descend that 1,500 feet or whatever it was, get below the deck, I know there's going to be a little bit of room and some flat land below me, and I can follow the Fraser River all the way home. So I thought, this is it. If I don't act now, I might never get another chance. I slowed the airplane down. I think we were at about 80 knots in a 172, and I dropped 10 degrees of flap and started to set up for a steep descending turn. So as I did that, I started it to the left, and we were descending through 3,000 feet, then through 2,500 feet. And I kept looking down. Directly ahead, I had pretty good visibility of the field. And then I would look up straight ahead, and I would look down. I could still see the field. And then I remember looking straight ahead, and everything was completely gray, and I couldn't see anything anymore. I don't recall entering cloud. I don't recall if it closed in around me. I just know I looked up and everything was gone. The altimeter said somewhere between 2,500 and 2,000 feet. And everything, as I said, was completely gray, and I was turning. I think it's important to pause here, because what came into my head at that point was something I believe which saved my life. If we back up a year or two, I used to work the dispatch desk at the flight school where I was instructing and had been flying that aircraft from. There was an older gentleman, a British guy, who had started flying around World War II, and he had a lot of experience. And I remember one day at the desk, it was just me and him, and he said, young man, if you ever find yourself in cloud, climb. I thought, oh, well, why is he telling me this? I asked, okay, how come? And he said, because if you start climbing, eventually you're going to be above the highest obstacle around you, and there's nothing you can run into. I thought, wow, that's nice. That's interesting. Good to know. Back to that situation. What do you think the first thing that came into my mind was? It was that conversation. And the first thing I did, level the wings and start climbing immediately. I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't done that. Second thing I did, 125.2 on the right side of the radio, moved it over to the main side and made a call to Vancouver terminal. Now, I don't know if it was denial or if it was just trying to remain calm, but it was a fairly calm initial call. Nothing to get their attention, just the standard Vancouver terminal, 172 here by Mission. Luckily, the controller got back to me right away. They asked me to squawk ident, which I did. And I was on instruments at the time, starting to climb through about 2,500 feet. So I reported my altitude. And at that time, let them know that I was in cloud. And I believe I asked for a vector to a clearing or something to that effect. As if you could see on his screen where the clearing was.
Yeah.
And there was a long pause. Maybe it wasn't that long, but it was pronounced. The reason there was that long pause, which I later learned, is that I was at 2,500 feet in an area where the minimum vectoring altitude was 7,000. And
Wow.
Any controller could tell you that is a moment that's going to make your heart skip. So the controller then asked me if the aircraft was equipped for IFR flight. And it was, so I said yes. The next question, are you IFR rated? And I was not. So I told him no. I know now that any controller is going to ask those two questions, so you better have them ready to go. You might as well just get that out of there so they can start helping you. Are you equipped for IFR flight, and are you IFR rated? Because that changes the situation dramatically. Telling him I was not, he then gave me a heading to fly, which was 230 degrees, and asked me to climb to 5,000 feet. I started a left turn to heading 230, and I believe the altimeter was going through 3,000 feet at the time. And then all of a sudden, out of a gray windscreen, all I could see was a wall of trees. And instinctively, I pulled back on the control column and believe I turned to the left. It was very rapid. And as I did, I could feel the trees just smacking against the bottom of the airplane, and it was rapid. It was like a machine gun sound hitting the bottom of the airplane. And then all of a sudden they all went back into the cloud and I was still flying. At that point, my student decided it was time to say something. So she keyed the mic and screamed, "We just hit trees." And the controller came back and said, "Is everything okay?" And I responded, "I think so, we're still flying." But as I did, I could start to smell burning wood. So branches from the trees we had gone through had entered the engine and were now smoking and on fire inside the engine cowling. And that's all I could smell. And I think with that, that's what triggered a panic in me. And all of a sudden, the instruments stopped making sense. I was doing okay flying on instruments until that point. Whereas now, the attitude indicator looked like it was banked to the left. The heading indicator looked like I was turning right. Everything looked backwards, and the instruments looked like they were conflicting with each other. I don't believe they were, but I believe that's what extreme stress will do to your cognitive capacity. The only way I could explain it is imagine from that point driving on the wrong side of a highway in the fog, knowing that at any second there's going to be a semi-trailer's lights right in your windshield. Because I thought at any second there's just another mountain there, then I'm going to hit it and I'm going to die. So I was probably about to lose control of the airplane, if I'm honest. I believe there's a pamphlet that Transport Canada has out. I think it's 178 seconds. I'm not sure how many exactly. They tell you from when a non-instrument rated pilot would enter cloud to when they lose control. I had to have had about 40 seconds left. But then the second thing that I believe saved my life, the controller told me, if you just climb another 1,000 feet, you'll be above the highest obstacle in your vicinity. And so at that point, the panic shifted to something. It shifted to something else, something I could focus on. And it was just climb that last 1,000 feet. Thinking of how to get out of this was too much. Thinking about the mountains was too much, but I could focus on that. And so I focused on the airplane, focused on the instruments, and got that extra 1,000 feet. And right after I did, I kid you not, I punched out to the south overhead Abbotsford somewhere. And I remember looking at Abbotsford, Mount Sumas on the left, and I could actually see the Fraser Valley again. And it was beautiful. It was wow. Okay, we made it. And so at that point, I keyed the mic to the controller again and told him, thanks for his help. We're VFR. We'll see you later. And he said, no.
Yeah.
No. Stay with me. We're going to talk you back to Boundary Bay, which was wise. And so the controller actually talked me all the way back through the Langley control zone. I was bugging him, thinking I had to switch. I thought, oh, doesn't he know I'm about to enter the zone? I need to talk to Langley Tower. He's like, nope, we're good. We're talking to them for you. And it was good that he did. He started asking me questions, just making normal conversation, just making sure I was calm. He did a really good job. And he talked me right into the downwind for at Boundary Bay before switching me to the tower for landing clearance. Now, I didn't know at the time what the condition of the nose wheel was. I thought, did we damage that? Is that going to collapse on me when I land? Honestly, I just wanted to be down so bad at that point. So we touched down and the nose wheel held up. And yeah, maybe that's a good time to pause.
Yeah. I don't know if you kept teaching after that, but your career moved to air traffic control in a little bit after that, didn't it?
It did. I took a meaningful break. Let's put it that way. I was in university at the time, so I took a couple months just to focus on school. But to be honest, that was such a life-changing experience for me. I didn't really focus on school either after that. I did get back in the airplane a couple months later and get back instructing. But in the meantime, during that break, it occurred to me that if it wasn't for that air traffic controller, I wouldn't be here. And that got me thinking, not so much the fear of getting in an airplane again. I made sure I got back in an airplane again, and it didn't stop me from flying. But as a career, I thought, if that guy was able to make such a difference on my life, wouldn't that be cool if I could do the same? And by that summer, I was off to Cornwall, the Nav Canada Training Institute, training for air traffic control. Nice.
And your student on that day is now a commercial pilot for a major airline, so you didn't scare her too badly.
She's a captain with a major airline now, so she went on a much better pilot than me. And yeah, she's doing great, and we're still friends, believe it or not.
Great. Did you guys ever debrief together? Just kind of shoot the shit about what happened?
Literally, I did not talk about it for 2 years. And we kept in touch. And after I had actually checked out as an air traffic controller, and she was out on the East Coast flying in Navajo, we met up in Halifax maybe 2 years later. And that was the first time we talked about it. I think we had a beer and it just kind of came out. And yeah, and then I think we got out everything we needed to. And that was that. And we moved on. Yeah.
And you actually wrote a story for Flying Magazine. Is that kind of the first time you really kind of sat down and thought about the story and the lessons you learned?
I think when something like that happens, your subconscious works on it for a while. But it occurred to me a couple of years later that, this was something I was really ashamed of. But I couldn't let that shame mask the lesson, because there still are, and there were other people making those mistakes that I made. And so the motivation for sitting down and writing for that article for Flying Magazine was that if I lived, and I was fortunate enough to live through that experience, I owe it to the next person to pass that story on so that they might not make the same mistake.
And you recommended a book during your presentation called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. And I actually picked it up right after I started reading it. And I'm not done yet, but it's already got me thinking differently about decision-making as it pertains to flying. The subheading is Making Smarter Decisions When You Don't Have All the Facts. And that's pretty much aviation in a nutshell, I think.
That's absolutely aviation. That's every day pilots and controllers go to work. You're making decisions that and then reevaluating them. I think the most important thing I got from that book was the concept of what she calls resulting, where we look at the result of a decision and decide if it was a good decision or not. But really, that's not the way you go about making good decisions. You need to look over 1,000 of those potential decisions before you evaluate your decision-making process.
Yeah. There's actually a meme going around right now about coronavirus that I was like, oh, that's actually what she was talking about. And it says, like, if I gave you 100 Smarties and 3 of them are going to kill you, are you going to have even one of them? And it's like, yeah, you might get 97 good ones, but the 98th one's going to kill you.
Yeah, I'm not eating the Smarties.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for telling us that story. It's
my pleasure.
Yeah. And it is March 23rd, 2020. I'm trying to avoid coronavirus discussions on the podcast, but I am interested to hear how things are going as an air traffic controller in that world right now.
Well, it's interesting because of the self-isolation protocols and the quarantine issues around travel. I have not been back to work since the outbreak here. So yeah, it's a massive change we're all in the midst of right now, pilots and controllers. And I think my earlier slip to 2001 alludes to that. It really feels like 2001 all over again in terms of the impact to aviation.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And it might last longer even, because at least that was a single event. It's not an ongoing thing.
That's right. This is unfolding over time. Whereas, back in September 11th, though, I mean, people were still wondering when that next attack might happen. So I think the fear still, even though we look back in history and see it as one event, it still felt long at the time.
Right.
It'd be interesting how we look back at this 20 years on from it. But certainly we're having a similar impact. And I have no doubt we're going to come back leaner and meaner like we have before as an industry.
Yeah.
But it's certainly a wake-up call for all of us.
Yeah. Cool. Where can people find you online? You have a good blog and.
Well, I have a website where I write on aviation concepts. It's jamesmarasa.com, and on Twitter at jamesmarasa. I like to post stuff. I have a little more free time on my hands, so hopefully I can put out a bit more content in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I think that's all of our plan at the moment. It's like, all right, free time, let's do it.
Yeah, it's creative time. If we can look past the current events and use it, could be something valuable in the end, hopefully.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you.
Thanks very much, Warwick. It's my pleasure.
Thanks again to James for sharing that story. And thanks to you for listening. You can find show notes and links at flyingbc.com, and follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Flying British Columbia. I've also got a couple videos going up on YouTube in the next week or so please subscribe there. youtube.com/flyingbc. And if you're looking for more podcasts to listen to, my suggestions this week are Pilot to Pilot Podcast and the Stuck Mic Avcast. If you have any feedback or questions or people you think I should interview, please get in touch. Stay healthy, and I'll see you again soon in the skies over BC. Flying BC is a production of Formula Photographic.